Dr. Hailing Gemur. So we're Aleph El, the second day of Shell today, starting to blow the shofar. We're starting to get serious. Hamelech Pasada. It's funny because there's supposed to be an election in Canada any day now, and that's really what El is. It's when the Rebbeinu Shem's campaigning. He's out in the fields to attract constituents. So it's whenever you want to get a politician's ear, the best time to get it is on the campaign trail. So we should be able to get the Rebbeinu Shem's ear, and the Rebbeinu Shem should get our attention, and we should be able to get all that we need out of the new government, so to speak, for this year, best. So the Gemara was discussing how do we see from Anaf Eitz Avos, which is the words that the Torah uses to describe the Hadas. How do we know it's referring to the Hadas? So the Gemara says there's basically two properties, two characteristics that the leaves of the Hadas have that make them consistent with the Anaf Eitz Avos. One is that the leaves are large and they totally conceal the wooden stem. And the second part is that there's three leaves growing together and it looks almost like a braid of leaves that are covering the stem. That was the main point that the Gemara used to identify the Hadas. They did find another min that would meet that characteristics, which was the hirduf, but that was disqualified because its leaves are pointy and sharp. According to Rashi, they might even be harmful, they might even be poisonous, and because of their Hashem's ways are sweet. Hashem would never make us have to shake handle minim that were dangerous or that it could even hurt us. Therefore, we know it wouldn't be referring to the hirduf. And Rava brought a pasuk about emes v'shalom ha'heva. It has to be emes, it has to be shalom, it has to be good. And something that's damaging is not good. Rashi uses the fact that it's somewhat poisonous to disqualify from emes v'shalom. But Tosfos says the fact that it's sharp and it could scratch you is in and of itself a reason why it wouldn't comply with the emes v'shalom ha'heva. There was another line in the Gemara later on where Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov excluded all other meaning besides the Hadas because of Tam Eitzoy Upirya Shava. And when I learned this yesterday, I thought it was a little bit unusual because I thought that only the Esrog was Tam Eitzoy Upirya Shava. And Dave Zolti told us 2 days ago that when the Rebbeinu created the world, he wanted all the pairs to be that way, and only the Esrog complied. So I think the Ritva is not Goris, this shtickle, because of that reason, because only the Esrog is Eitzoy, was Tam Eitzoy Upirya Shava. Okay, so let's see where we are. Then we learned this final halacha, which I want to bring out another point on, and that is that Rav Yehuda said you need to have 3 leaves growing out of the same bud. Now, Rash seems to say that it's not just like us on the same level of height along the stick, but it's actually from the actual same bud they grew out together on the same point of the stem they grew out together, which I've never seen even 2 leaves growing out of the same stem, the same protrusion right out of the wooden stalk, the stem of the Hadas. So Tosfos actually says, and he argues, because Tosfos says this, that you need 3 leaves coming out of the same point on the stem, it's a huge chumrah, you don't find it. And therefore Tosfos explains it the way we understand it. It just means they're on the same level. You have 3 leaves growing out of the stem on the same level. Even though each one has its own bud that it grows out of. But they're still on the same level. So I think that's what we usually look for. When you have the 3 leaves grow out of the wooden stem at the same height level, but not necessarily growing out of the same growth together. Okay, let's see what the Gemara says. Then we had this other variation from a kahana, that if you have 2 leaves growing out of the same level and one's a little lower, that would also, although although Rav Ashi said that it was a Hadashaita, and then we had Rav Acha Bredi Rava, who would dafka wanted this type of Hadas because Rav Kahana expressed an opinion on it that it was mutter. I think we're up to Tanu Rabbanon, 4 lines from the bottom of the Aflamed base on the base. Tanu Rabbanon, Nashru Roiv Olav. What if most of the leaves of the Hadas fell off? V'nishtaru by miut, and only a miut of the leaves remained on. Kosher, it will be kosher. You just need some conditions. It still has to have that appearance of that braided covering of leaves. That's impossible. Hagufa kosher. Amrit noshru roif olav kosher. You said even if most of the leaves fall off, it's kosher. But then you say the condition. If most of the leaves fell off, how in the world are you going to be able to say, given Nashlu pray, once 2 out of 3 leaves fall off, how will it be remain that look of a braided covering? It's impossible. It's possible to find that you can lose roiv of the leaves, and you'll still have a nice braided covering of the stem in the asa mitzvah. The kaima shiva b'chatina. They have 7 leaves on each area, on each level. The chinasri arba, even if 4 out of the 7 leaves fall off, which is roiv alav, pashalu tlasa, you still have 3 leaves remaining. How is it that this plant grows with such a lush growth around it? So Rashi says it's gadol al meitzer shalasada. It normally doesn't grow in the center where it's crowded. It grows on the edge of a field. Since it has a lot of space to be able to grow, okay? So mitzvah can either mean border, it's around the border of a field, or it can mean from Mitzrayim, an Egyptian hadas, which then Rashi does not explain how it is that flourishes so well. Amrabai, Shemamina, you see from here, as an aside, that high asa mitzvah kosher lo shama, it's going to be kosher to use as your rava. Shita frankly Gemara, it's pasha that you can use it. Why shouldn't you be able to use it? Mao the tema, what you might say, hayol the islay shem lovely. Since it's not just called a plain asa, it's called an asa mitzvah. So maybe that would say that it's not really a hadas. When mishkasher kamash one. Frankly Gemara, the ema hachanami. Maybe taka, it's not good. It's not a hadas. It's a aslava. So Gemara, eitz avos amar chamana. Never does the Torah identify the requirement that it has to be a hadas. The Torah doesn't even use the word hadas. The Torah uses characteristics. Eitz avos amar chamana. When do you say Hashem lavoi is not acceptable? Is not the same item? That's if there's any type of requirement for that item specifically, like the Torah mentioned it. But the Torah never mentioned that item specifically. It mentioned a characteristic, so any plant that has that characteristic would be eligible. What if most of the leaves got dried out? In the shower by Shleisha, Bade, Alin, Lachin. And you had 3 stalks, so we know we used 3 hadasim. You had 3 stalks, and on each of the 3 stalks, at the top, there's 1 set of 3 leaves. Kosher, you'll have kosher hadasim. It means at the top, you can't have at the bottom. At the top of each of your 3 hadas stems, there has to be the 3 green, fresh leaves, then it'll be good. So Rashi says, so you alim halachin b'rashay about them. The good leaves have to be right at the top of your hadasim. It's not considered hodar unless the leaves, the nice fresh leaves, are on the top. Niktim Roshay. What if the top of it gets snipped off? Tani ulubachina. Niktim Roshay, but also by tomorrow. If now Niktim Roshay, the Rishonim explained, doesn't mean if the leaf got torn off. It actually means that the actual stem had to have been clipped. So if the stem was clipped, so it's raw, that's not hodar, it's going to be puzzle. But what if a little growth grew on it? Rashi kamin tomorrow, like a little date. Ke'ein hanimta ba'alei arava, like we find on the leaves of the arava. Sometimes it's like a little growth stuck on the leaf. Kamin peri yark, like a little green peri. And they actually use it, but women use it to act as a dye. So some little growth grew on it, so now it's not like a raw cut stem. Kosher, then it will be cut. How about Niktam Roshim Erev Yom Tov? Erev Yom Tov was Niktam Roshim, which means the Hadash became puzzle. Erev Yom Tov. But also like tomorrow Yom Tov. And on Yom Tov, it grew. And Rashi says, Misha Negad, the Metolish Nami Salkabet. But when it was after it was bundled together, so it was already a lulav, then it got healed. And Rashi is pointing out, how could something grow? How could a growth grow on a stem of a hadlas once it's already cut off from the tree? So Rashi is saying this occurs even though you've already cut off the stem and it's already separated in your lulav. It's still possible for this thing to grow. So the shaila is as follows: Mahu, what is halacha? You say yesh dichu etel mitzvahs. There was a point where this stem was not kosher to be used in your lulav because it was niktam, but it healed itself. So you say once it's pushed away from being able to be mekayim a mitzvah with it, it can no longer be used. Eloi, or no, it could get restored. And Rashi gives us some insight, because we never find the concept of dichu by mitzvahs. The concept of dichu you find by kodshim. So Rashi says yesh dichu etel mitzvahs. Kloimer, meheges toras dichu etel mitzvahs. There's this entire concept, this idea of once it's rejected, it's permanently rejected. Does this concept apply to mitzvahs? Like we know, that's halacha by a carbon. If something went wrong with this carbon after it was shechted, it could not become good again. If some psul occurs in the carbon after the shechita, even though that psul ends up going away, nevertheless, once a carbon is no longer fit to be brought as a carbon, it can no longer become fit again. So this is a concept that only applies to kodshim. However, the Gemara here is clearing, maybe we should apply it to mitzvahs as well. There are those Rishonim will learn it's only midirabanan, because technically dicha is only a concept that applies to karbanos. Since it was pushed away from being a hadas when it got clipped, it can no longer be rectified by growing this growth on it. It remains rejected. Now, we know that when it comes to dichai, there's a concept of nira v'nitzcha. Once it's already shechted, it's a part of the carbon, it was a kosher carbon, and then something happens to it, that it should be rejected, then it cannot be restored as a carbon. But what happens if you had an animal that was never right to be a carbon, and then they had a mum, and then its mum got healed and it was right? That's something that was never near of a nitcha. That most people hold that there's no dichui there because it wasn't nitcha. It could only be nitcha once it was already a carbon, then it could be nitcha. But if it was never right to be a carbon, that wouldn't be called dichui. Here, when the hadas was clipped, it wasn't near of a nitcha. It was never right to be part of your mitzvah. Before Yom Tov, it was clipped. Right? If before Yom Tov was clipped, so when Yom Tov came, it was never right to be the mitzvah. It's not like when Yom Tov arrived, this hadas was kosher. Then the hadas became kosher. Then it became kosher again. Here, before Yom Tov, it was never kosher. So here, it's not even near the mitzvah. So maybe it's not even comparable at all to the case of karbanis, where we say dichui. So Rashi points that out, and Rashi says, at this point in the Gemara is not drilling down in that great detail. Because technically, this case where it was Niktam Erev Yom Tov, it was never Nira, because Nira means once the mitzvah applies, which is when Yom Tov arrives, that's when you could say it was Nira v'nitzvah. But this, when Yom Tov arrived, it was already clipped, so maybe it wouldn't be similar to the Shaila of Dichu Eitzel Karbanos. Why can't we be pushed the Shaila from the following brisa? It says as follows: Bakisu Adam, you know the halacha is if you shecht either an oif or a chaya, you have to cover its blood with earth. I remember in the good old days when we still used to go to the shlachtos to do kaparis, so they would have sand on the floor or sawdust on the floor, and then they would shecht the bird, they would spritz, let some of its blood run on the sawdust, and then they would take more sawdust and cover it over, and sometimes they would let you do it in the mekayim, the mitzvah of kisu and dam. You have to cover the dam with sawdust. So what would happen if kiso, you covered the dam of either a chay or noif, Rashi says, Miniskala, some wind came along and blew the sand away, and now the dam is exposed again. So the halacha is potter milachasus. You're potter for making another kisui, but since you made a kisui already, you've discharged the chiyuv to make a kisui. What about kisei aruach? What if you never made kisui? Well, what happened is after the shchita, the dam went on the floor, suddenly a wind came and blew some earth or dust or sawdust, whatever it is, on top of the blood. So you never made kisui adam, but you can no longer make kisui adam because you can't cover dam that's already covered. That would be a dumb idea. So to Gemara, chayav l'chasois kisei ruach, but then the wind blew it away. So the wind covered it, and then the wind blew away the sawdust that was covering. So now it's exposed again. Chayav l'chasois, there you are mechuyev because you never discharged the mitzvah. Of course, you only have to make kisui adam if the wind blew away the sawdust, so now it's uncovered again. But if it's still covered, there's nothing to cover. And the Gemara cleared a shaila over there. The Gemara asked the kasha actually. Even if the wind came and blew away the covering that the wind brought, why would you be chayav to make kisui adam again? Maybe you have dicha itzal mitzvahs. Since the wind came and covered over the dam originally, so now it pushed away the mitzvah. If it was not uncovered, if the dam stayed covered, you don't have a chiyuv to do kisei adam because you can't; it's already covered. But since there was a time after the shechita of this animal when you were potter from making kisei adam, because at that point it was still covered, maybe itchila olam, and maybe even though the wind comes and now uncovers the dam, maybe once the mitzvah is pushed away, it remains pushed away. So that's very relevant to our shaila with the hadas. Maybe once the mitzvah gets pushed away, it remains pushed away forever. And Rav Papa commented on this question. From here you see that this whole concept of dichli does not apply to mitzvahs. And therefore, even though there's a time you were potter from doing kisui adam over here, because the wind had covered it over, nevertheless, when it becomes uncovered, you're mechuyev to do the kisui again. And you don't say it's dichli. So we could ask the same shaila by us. If you have a hadas that when Yom Tov came, it was clipped, and then it grew back a covering, which would now make this hadas kosher, we can say that ein dichets on mitzvahs, and therefore the hadas will be good. Therefore, you don't have a right from Rav Papa that the hadas will be good, because your Rav Papa gufel miboiler. Rav Papa's comment, in and of itself, we're asking Rav Papa, who made this comment and said that don't think you're potter from doing kisui adam. Rather, now you need to do kisui adam again. We're not sure if he said it because he was sure, or if he only said it machmasofit. Is it mipshit poshetlei? Was Rav Papa 100% sure that in dichei mitzvahs, and that's why he was mechayev the person to make kisui adam? But loishna lekulov loishna lechumra. He's so sure about it that even in our case of hados, where he's being makel because he's allowing us to use this hados that might be possible. That's a kula. The fact that he's mechayev you to make kisui adam, that's not a kula. That's a chumra. He's not telling you to make a bracha on it. He's just telling you to make the kisui adam. L'chumra, he's being mechayev to do that action again. But who said he's so sure that ein dichoi to mitzvahs that he'll even allow you to use this hados that might be possible? Maybe Rav Papa wasn't sure. He only said it l'chumra to be mechayev you to do kisui adam because you might be chayev in it. But the kula lo, who said that he would be so sure about that he would also allow you to use this hados that became nitche because it was niktam when Yom Tov arrived? So we still have a shaila. Do you say dichui by mitzvahs or not? And even though Rav Papa commented that you do, Rav Papa might only have said it that you have to be machmer on either side of the suffix. Let's argue that this shaila of dichui or mitzvahs is dependent on the machlokes tonight. Over the likton possible. So we had in our Mishnah that if there's too many berries on your hadas, it's possible. But you're allowed to take the berries off. But what happens if you took them off? So let's see what Rashi says about Over V'Liktam. We had this Gemara before, the same Gemara before. So Over V'Liktam, look Rashi, in Hadas. You pulled these berries off of the Hadas that were passing. So you Merubah Me'alam, because there were more berries than leaves. But Tanan, we learned in Miyatan Kosher. You're allowed to, if you take the berries off, it will now make the Hadas kosher. However, our Mishnah also says, V'ein Memaitin B'yomtov, Mishim Shvus, Shedaimer L'Masakin Kliu Mashiroi. You're not allowed to do this correction on the Hadas by removing its berries on Yom Tov, because that's prohibited on Yom Tov to be Misakin Akeli, and you're being Misakin this Hadas. However, the over meat and possible. But if you did it wrongfully, it will be possible. The question is, why would it be possible? So it says in the Brisa, over looked in possible, Divrei Rabbi Lazar ben Tzadok. The Chacham Machshirim, they say it's kosher. So what could be the reasoning behind this machlokes if you pull these berries off on Yom Tov? Because just because you were over on the Isser of being the sakin on Yom Tov, that shouldn't passel the Hadas. That just says you weren't allowed to do it. But why would the Hadas be possible? So Svarua, we're making an assumption. The Rabbanan, the Midrash Rashi says, made an assumption. Let's say everybody says lulav ein tzarich agid. Now there's a lot of different factors that come to play here. There's the factor of tasa v'loy menas. If you have to bundle together the three meaning, the lulav, the hadas, and the rava, if they have to be bundled together, and that's the asiya that makes the lulav assembly kosher, then if you made that assembly while the hadas was puzzle, because it had too many berries, and only after that you pulled off berries, there might be a problem of tasa v'loy menas, because when you bundled it together, it was not kosher, and then retroactively made it kosher by pulling the berries off. That would be a problem of tasa v'loy menas. So therefore, the Gemara first has to push away and reject that, or basically circumvent that problem. So the Gemara wants to say the chulam lulav ein tzarich agid. The lulav never has to be tied. So therefore, there's no problem of tasa v'loy menas, because you have your set of you have your lulav set. It's not kosher yet. You pull the berries off, and now it's kosher. But there's no din that there has to be an igud, and therefore the fact that they were tied together before the berries were removed don't pose any problem. And if you hold that a lulav does have to be bound together, so now there is a potential problem of tasa v'loy menas, because when you bound them together, this hadas was not kosher because there are too many berries. But maybe there's no problem of tasa v'loy menas by a lulav. Sukka lulav. We know by Sukka we learned for sure there is a problem of tasa v'loy menas. The Chsiv Ba by the Sukka, it says tasa v'loy menas. But just because there's a problem or a requirement of tasa v'loy menas by Sukka, maybe that problem or that requirement does not apply to a lulav. So therefore, there's no issue. The discussion between Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok and the Chachamim has nothing to do with the problem of tasa v'loy menas, either because it's not relevant, because lulav ein tzarich agid, or because there is no requirement of tasa v'loy menas for hadas. So then, what could the potential problem be once we've shown that it's not relevant to tasa v'loy menas? Let's suggest that this is their machlokes. The man the apostle, the man who holds the apostle is the Tanakama. They say there's dichoy, and therefore, since at one point his hadas was not good because there are too many berries, therefore it's dochli, and you could never use it to be mekayim the mitzvah of arba minim. The machshir and Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok holds it kosher. I'm sorry, that's Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok holds it apostle, and the chachamim who are machshir, they savar learning yeshtichai shel mitzvahs. So now we have a tana, a machlokes tanaim about our shayla that we were discussing in our Gemara. If yeshtichai or endichai, can you correct the hadas after it was possible? So the question discussed in the brisa was the psul was too many berries. Our shayla was if it grew, if it was clipped and it grew, but the gabi dichai shel mitzvahs should have the same halacha. And so you seem to have here a machlokes that discusses whether there's dichai by the hadas. That's not necessarily what the machlokes is. We have other options to explain the machlokes between the Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok and the Chachamim. Maybe everybody agrees you don't say dichai shel mitzvahs, and therefore our hadas that grew, that was clipped and grew for sure would be kosher. So what's their machlokes about? Maybe they are arguing about the requirement of tasa v'leminasi. Mar savar yalfinan lulav misukah. The Tanakama or a Belazar Tzaddik holds that you learn lulav from sukkah, and there's a problem of tasa v'leminasi, and that's why it wasn't good. Umar savar the chamim were machshir savar lo yalfinan lulav misukah, and there's no problem of tasa v'leminasi. Or v'yisema, or we have another option. Everybody can hold. If you hold lulav tzarich agad, kula amu yalfinan lulav misukah. Maybe everybody holds there is a requirement of tasa v'leminasi by lulav as well. And if lulav is tzarich agad, then you would have a problem here of tasa v'leminasi, because when you bound the lulav together, at that point adasim were possible because there are too many berries. But maybe the machlokes for Belazar Tzaddik and the chachamim is whether or not lulav tzarich agad. Lulav tzarich agad community. So just to summarize, at the end of the day, we have a machlokes between Rabbi Elazar Tzaddik, who holds that this is possible, and the Chum holds this kosher. There's three possibilities of what their machlokes might be. They might be arguing of dichli etzl mitzvahs. They might be arguing if the requirement of tasa v'leminasi, which we know applies to sukkah, they might be arguing whether or not it applies to lulav as well. Or number three, they might be arguing. They might be arguing about whether or not lulav tzarich eged, which would then determine whether or not the problem tasa v'leminasi. Now, where do you find the machlokes of whether or not the lulav has to be bound together? But more the Tanya lulav bein agud bein she'ein agud kosher. A lulav, whether it's bound or not, it's going to be kosher. If you don't have agud kosher, she'ein agud possible. If it's bound together, it's kosher. If it's not bound together, then it's possible because it needs to be bound. So you see, Rabbi Yehuda holds the lulav tzarich agud. My time with Rabbi Yehuda. What is for Rabbi Yehuda that says it needs to be bound? Yalef lekicha me'agudas ezav. By agudas ezav, which was when Klal Yisrael were preparing to go out of Mitzrayim, and they were preparing their Pesach, their Korban Pesach by night, they were told to take an agudas ezav and smear blood on the doorposts. So Ksiv Hacha, it says regarding the chiyuv to take the lulav nesrek, ulakachtem lachem b'yom harishon, uksiv hasam by Yitzis Mitzrayim, ulakachtem agudas ezav, mala alam aguda, just like the lakicha there involved in a bundled together grass. Afkan, so too when we're talking about taking the Arbaminim, it means bundled together aguda. Rabbanan less lakicha, and the Rabbanan hold they didn't have a Kabbalah for that Gzera Shava to say that the lulav has to be bundled together with the meat. And that's a machlokes. If you have here a machlokes whether it's required for Gzera Shava, and if you didn't do it, it's possible, or if there's no such Gzera Shava and there's no requirement at all, who's going to be the author of the following time? Lulav mitzvah. We have a Tana who holds that Chili is supposed to, but if you didn't, it's kosher anyway. Money. If you hold like Rabbi Yehuda, that's mandatory because you have a Gzera Shava from agudas ezav kilo agdei my kosher. Why would it be kosher with the Evet? And the Rabbanon, according to Rabbanon, there is no requirement of time together. My mitzvah covered. Why is it a mitzvah lechatchila to do? Really, it's going according to Rabbanon, and there is no Gzera Shava to learn that there's a mandate that you have to tie together. So why do you have to tie it together lechatchila? It happens to look much nicer when you have it bundled together. And since it's nice when you have it bundled together, that's why you should do it. But it's not mandatory, and therefore, if you didn't, it's kosher anyway. What if you had a hadith that had too many berries on it? This halacha that I'm about to quote, Rabbeinu Agadol said this, and the Rebbeinu Shalom should be there to support it. And this is as follows: that we say that if there's too many berries, it's going to be possible. That's only if they're concentrated in one place, and there they overwhelm the leaves. All the berries are together. There's more berries in that area than all of the leaves on the entire stalk. But if they're spread around, kosher, it will be kosher. So Rava said, or Amar Rava is have a bachas bears. Amar Rava, Shnayim Ushloishim Mekaymes have a manumar apostle. Rava disagrees and says that even if it's in 2 or 3 places, it's called manumar. Manumar is spotted like a leopard, and it's going to be apostle. And Rashi says, why? The lav hodahu. That's not hodar. The grapes or the berries are black, but al niraikim. So therefore, it'll look patchy, it'll look manumar, and it'll be possible. So that cannot be what Rabbeinu Hagadol said. If there's more berries than leaves, it's possible. And Rab Chisda said, this great thing Rabbeinu said, Rabbeinu Shalom should support him, and that is the only time you say berries passel a hadas if they're black, so they're the wrong color. Rashi says, when they grow, they're actually the same color as the leaf. But as the hadas ages, the berries dry out and become dark. But if the berries are still green, meaning the hadas are kosher, that will not pass. Then it's completely kosher. Amar Papa, reddish berries are treated like black. If you find black blood, really it's really real blood, which is red. It went bad and it turns black. But really, red is one of the colors that will lead to being black, and therefore it won't be possible. You see here, berries won't passel if the berries are green. Amit and kosher. Who was the one at what time, at what point did we take the berries off? If before you bundled the hadas together with the lulav, you pulled the berries off, shita, of course it's going to be kosher. Why shouldn't it be kosher? There's no psul of tasav loy also here. The asiya is bundling them together, and when you bundled them together, you had already removed those berries, so there shouldn't be a problem there. Elamai, you're saying that it's going to be kosher even after you bundled it. If only then you pull the berries off, then it's going to be kosher. Zok Gemara, dichim me'akaru. That's dichim me'akara. Because when you bundled it together, it was never royu to be a kosher hadas. It had too many berries. So at least tifshet minah that dichim me'akara lo have a dichim. At least let's prove from here that if it was never royu to be a hadas, because it had too many berries on it, and you bundled it together, and then you took the berries off, at least agree to me that you see from this halacha, this mishnah, that you say dich me'akar lo have a dichud. That tomorrow no lo'olam basad agdei. Maybe it's speaking like we said that you took the berries off after, and it is a dich me'akar. But the kasavar agad has mana ba'amu. You don't have a right that dich me'akar is not a dichud, because maybe this isn't even a dich me'akar, because maybe there's no chiyuv to bundle together. Bundling it together is just preparing it. In other words, Rashi, maybe when it's not the bundling that makes it into the hadas, that makes it into the mitzvah, and therefore, since you bundled it and then you pulled the grapes off, it was dichum ekara. No, maybe what makes them to the hadas is the arrival of Yom Tov. If you bundled your lulav together before Yom Tov, that's nothing. That's just preparing it for Yom Tov. The dichum ekara only takes effect once Shkia comes, once it's night, once Yom Tov starts. But here, you pull the berries off before Yom Tov. So if you pull the berries off before Yom Tov, that's not even Dichum Me'ekara, because when you came into Yom Tov, it was kosher straight away. And therefore, you don't have a raya to the halach of Dichli here at all. You're not allowed to pull berries off on Yom Tov. So tomorrow, I believe they're starting to daven shachris at 10 to 7 today, not at 7 o'clock. Is that true? Because if that's the case, we should probably stop here.
I don't know. The loop says 7. It doesn't say 10 to 7. But is that a mistake?
Even for Monday?
Yeah.
Only for Monday. Okay, so if the loop says 7, then that's probably what it is. Okay, so let's go on. If you actually did pull off the grapes when you're supposed to, it's going to be kosher. Because the Mishnah says you shouldn't take it off on Yom Tov. But in mashma, that if you did pull it off, it'll be kosher. The ashcha aims. When did these berries go bad? If even before Yom Tov, they were already possible. Well, dichum me'ekar, it's dichum me'ekar. Tevship ina, dichum me'ekar, do I have a dichum? You should be able to bring a raya. A dichum me'ekar is not a dichum because you pulled them off on Yom Tov. Elalav, the ashcha b'Yom Tov. Elamai, you want to say it's speaking where when you came into Yom Tov, the lulav was kosher, because at that point the berries weren't the problem. Now that's more kosher. And then on Yom Tov, after it already became part of the mitzvah, then berries passel, the berries turned black, and it passel the hadas. Well, that's even worse. That's near v'nitchu. Near v'nitcha for sure is a dichu. Shmas mina near v'nitcha chayzer v'nir. You have even a stronger raya that even though at the beginning of Yom Tov, this hadas was kosher hadasim, and then it became passel on Yom Tov, you could still correct it on Yom Tov, and it'll still become kosher again. So tomorrow you don't have a raya. Let's say that these berries were already dark before Yom Tov arrived, and therefore it's dicha meikara. And we have a raya, dicha meikara, you can bring a raya from this Mishnah that dicha meikara is not a problem, because that's what this case was. You put it together, Yom Tov arrived, and all along the berries were black, and therefore it had dasim repulsal. And you pulled the berries off on Yom Tov, and you made that dasim kosher. So you see that at least dicha meikara is not a dicha. Avol nir v'nitcha, that should be chayzer v'nir l'shifshet. You can't bring merai from here that if it was kosher going into Yom Tov, and then it became possible, then pulling the berries off of kosher, that you don't see, because maybe the case is where the berries were already possible before Yom Tov. Tell me about them. You're not allowed to pull berries off of the hadassah on Yom Tov. Rabbi Elazar B'Shimon said you are allowed to pull berries off of Yom Tov. How could the Rabbi Elazar B'Shimon allow it? You're fixing, you're rectifying this hadis on Yom Tov. That cannot be allowed. Dr. Gemara, Amar Rashi, don't say that he pulled it off with the intention of making the hadis kosher. He wanted to have berries. He wanted to enjoy some berries, and that's why he took it off. So it's a davar sheini mischaven. His kavanah wasn't to be misaken mana. His kavanah was to eat berries, which we're allowed to do on Yom Tov, and that happened agavarcha. The tikkun of the hadis happened agavarcha. In fact, the more Rabbi Elazar B'Shimon travel kavua, Rabbi Elazar B'Shimon hold a kavua. Davar sheini mischaven mutter. He'll hold like his father Rabbi Shimon, who holds that davar sheini mischaven mutter. For instance, you're allowed to drag a bench. That's the classic example. You're allowed to drag a bench across the yard, even though it might cut a groove in the yard, but might not. Since your kavanah is not to dig a groove in the yard, your kavanah is just to move the bench from place A to place B, it's not a problem. But by psikresha, and the concept of psikresha comes from if you cut off the bird, the head of a bird, will it not die? It'll for sure die. So even if the reason why you cut off the head of the bird was for some other purpose, not to kill the bird, like to use the head as a ball to play with, is what the Gemara says, it's for sure going to die. Whenever you're doing something with the other intention, but it's for sure going to cause the other thing to happen, like in our case. In our case, you're pulling the berries off, not with the intention to fix the hadassim, but with the intention to eat them. But it's inevitable that the hadas in the process will also become corrected. That's going to be a problem. That'll be usher. So once again, why does Rabbi Elazar B'Shimon allow one to remove berries from a hadas on Yom Tov? Rashi learns he had other Ishanas. So in fact, he wasn't even planning to use these Ishanas at all for his lulav. He had other hadassim that he was using for lulav. They were kosher. So in fact, this is not even the Davar Sheini Mischaven Tzukreisha. He's not even making it into a hadas because he's not even planning on using it. Tanur Rabbanan, Puter Iguda B'Yom Tov. What if the bundling opened up on Yom Tov? So now it's going to be possible. If you hold that it has to be bundled together, it's not bundled together. So what are you going to do? The halach is Agdai Kagudo Shalyer. You make like a temporary knot, like before they had Velcro on the gartel, let's say the tire, you would wrap it around and around the gartel, and then you would just stick it in. You wouldn't make a knot. So that's how you could fix the bundling of your lulav on sukkahs. Why don't you just make a bow? Why don't you tie it like a bow? That's also a much more secure way of doing it than just stripping it in. Maybe we're going to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that making a bow is considered a proper knot, and he doesn't allow that to be done on Shabbos. If you're saying that this Tana who holds Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow that. Rabbi Yehuda holds it has to be a proper tie. So how could you say that if it opened up on Yom Tov according to Rabbi Yehuda, you just push it in after you wrap it around? that would not be acceptable according to Rabbi Yehuda. Dr. Moore, you're right. The Tana of our Brisa is not Rabbi Yehuda, but he holds like Rabbi Yehuda in one attack. Hi Tana Savla Kavasa Bechada Upigul Poligla Bechada. He holds like Rabbi Yehuda that you're not allowed to make a bow on Shabbos and Yom Tov, but he argues with Rabbi Yehuda that he holds you don't have to have a proper tying for the ego of the lulav. It's enough if you just dip it in, that will be good enough. That explains this Tana. I guess like we could stop here. We're getting very close to Shachris. We'll stop here. Tomorrow. I'll get in the Chodesh, everybody.